Welcome to Thursday night's football show. It's Richie McCormack here with you. What a week it has been so far. One of managerial tumult in the Premier League, in particular with Brendan Rodgers losing his job at Leicester on Sunday, and Bruno Salvatore in temporary charge of Chelsea for their midweek game with Liverpool in the Premier League. And he's now out of a job too, because Frank Lampard has been installed as the caretaker Chelsea boss until the end of this season. We'll have John Giles on the football show a little bit later on, but I'm delighted to say, to look at this Everton part, this Chelsea appointment, old habits die hard. We're joined on the line by Jonathan Wilson. Jonathan, good evening to you.
Evening, how are you doing?
We should have seen this coming by dint of the madness of this season, first of all, but all these shots of Frank Lampard sitting, looking on interestedly at the Liverpool game on Tuesday night. We all thought, oh, isn't this nice? Club legend brought back into the fold, and he's just being given a nice warm welcome, getting a nice comfy seat up in the director's box. And it was, I think, barely 12 hours later, Frank Lampard is being linked with the Chelsea job on a temporary basis. It makes perfect sense, and it makes no sense all at once.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of putting it. And you know, the fact that we all saw him there on Tuesday night and nobody made the link, I think tells you how bizarre this feels. And yet, you're right, it does sort of make sense that they need somebody to see them through at the end of the season. I'm really not convinced that bringing Lampard in is better than having Potter there sing it through to the end of the season. I think that's been the oddity, really, of these, well, certainly 3 of these 4 sackings we've had in the last couple of weeks, that the clubs almost seem to have decided that no manager is better than the manager they had, which, I mean, in certain cases, maybe you do get to a point where anything to sort of break the rhythm is necessary. I'm not really sure why Chelsea needed that. Chelsea in the 2 games against Dortmund in the Champions League, although they lost the first one 1-0, I thought played pretty well. I'm not sure really what's gained by not having Potter in charge for the games of, at least for the game against Real Madrid, and then potentially beyond that. But once you've made that decision, do you want Bruno, who, a bloke who used to play fullback for Brighton, who I have to say, it took me quite a while to realise that
same guy.
It was the same person.
Yeah.
Bruno Salvatore was that Bruno, because he never used that surname when he was at Brighton. But do you go with him, or do you go with Frank Lampard, who is a club legend, who, despite his pretty disappointing managerial reign at Chelsea, it remains a legend as a player, and will at least have a crowd on side. They've gone with the latter, and I guess in the very short term, it may work. I'm less than convinced by Lampard's tactical nous in the biggest games. I was looking back through his European record when he was Chelsea manager, and he didn't have a lot of big games. There's a lot of fairly drab group games. But the big games he did have were against Bayern Munich, and they lost 7-1 over 2 legs and were battered out of sight. So that doesn't bode well. I guess he does know Carlo Ancelotti. Whether that makes a difference, maybe. But, as in terms of things Todd Boehly has done since arriving at Chelsea, this isn't the craziest.
Yeah, I think it was Oliver Kay made the point yesterday before the appointment was made, that a lot of people saying that this doesn't make any sense. And, we alluded to it there at the top of the segment. But I think Oliver said that this might be the first thing that Todd Boehly's done that actually does make a bit of sense, because they do have bigger beasts that they want to perhaps bring on board as manager in the summer, or maybe later in the season, depending on how it goes. And just managing to steady the ship is something that they wanted to do by bringing Lampard on board. But you could go back to September and you think, would Chelsea be in a worse off position than they are now if they still had Thomas Tuchel in charge? And that's the madness of the managerial merry-go-round, is that in no other real business would top-level jobs be doled out with such a lack of planning. And yet these multi-million pound, multi-billion pound businesses just seem to have scant regard for who's actually steering the ship. It's just really strange.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, there's so many inefficiencies there in the system that you just sort of think I guess Manchester City have done it. Manchester City have got a lot of money, and they've thought, right, who's the best manager in the world? Who's the best coach in the world? Who's got a philosophy that's clearly guiding everybody else? Pep Guardiola. For a long time before Guardiola arrived, Guardiola was clearly, to an extent, conditioning how the not necessarily directly, but was conditioning how the club was being built. The fact they brought in Ferran Soriano and Chiba Givestein, people who'd worked with Barcelona. The academy was clearly constructed on a Guardiola model. So that's how you do it. You work out the man you want and you build a philosophy that will fit him, and you build everything around that. I think a lot of clubs, they chuck as much money as they can. If it doesn't work, you sack the manager because it's easy to blame him and look at the processes. And that, I mean, as far as you can work out anything, any pattern to what's happening at Chelsea, that appears to be what's going on. But I mean, this feels to me, I mean, there is the obvious caveat and quite a big caveat that Lampard has already had 18 months as Chelsea manager. But this feels to me a bit like Solskjaer being brought into Manchester United after Mourinho. They just need somebody. I mean, I think he used the phrase "steady the ship." I think it's almost the opposite of that. I think Todd Boehly likes to portray himself as a great disruptor, and the problem with Chelsea was almost the ship was too steady. They needed to rock the ship, and Lampard is a disruptive presence. His management style, I think, is not orthodox. I think it's probably fair to say, and he's kind of got a free hit. I think he's got maybe 5 games in the Champions League. I think more reasonably 2, where he gets to have a crack at a Champions League quarter-final. It does feel, though, a little bit like, I mean, the cliche of a competition winner getting to play a game. It almost feels like Lampard's a competition winner. Go on, have a go at a Champions League quarter-final, see how you get on. And then, of course, you start to think, well, what happens if Lampard wins that quarter-final? Did Chelsea get themselves in the position that Manchester United were in with Solskjaer, where they accidentally appoint him and ruin the next 2 years as well?
I can't get past that because I still have this nagging feeling, and you alluded to it there. They, under Potter, did actually play pretty well in the Champions League and acquitted themselves very well against what at the time, and I know the last week or so has probably impacted on the perception of them, what at the time was a very good Borussia Dortmund side and performing very well at the time. And they're up against a Real Madrid team who are firing on all cylinders, who blew past Barcelona last night with ease, scoring goals for fun. And yet you still kind of think back to the Chelsea of like a decade ago when Roberto Di Matteo was put in a pretty similar position as Lampard, where it's like, all right, go in there, see what you can do and get us to the end of the season. Like, if he's a success, they can't sack him. And yet they have these big managers like Luis Enrique, doing loops at the airport, and Julian Nagelsmann, who's holding loops as well. And they're in discussions with, maybe half a dozen more, depending on what organ you read. And yet you could have it's not beyond the realms of possibility, a very successful few months for Frank Lampard in the job, which makes him unsackable. What do they do then?
Yeah, I mean, can they beat Real Madrid? That's the first thing. Well, yeah, they can. I don't think Real Madrid are that good. They. I mean, the game against Barcelona, although they ended up being completely dominant, that first 20 minutes, half an hour, they're on the back foot. I think they're a very patchy side, that the good patches that are very good, but they do have these down patches. I mean, this is not an argument that holds any scientific water, but there is a sense that Real Madrid have ridden a lot in the last couple of years. That you look at the Champions League one last year, that, I mean, even the final, but certainly the semi-final, quarter-final, the last 16, they at most had a good half hour in each of those, not even in each of those games, each of those ties, but in that half hour scored 3 or 4 vital goals. Even the final, I think, was it 21 shots to 4? I think Liverpool had. I mean, the final didn't feel as absurd as the PSG game or the Chelsea second leg or particularly not the City game, but still, Liverpool would point at the XG and say, well, we won that pretty comfortably. So you sort of feel Real Madrid's luck has got to turn at some point. They can't keep relying on a 35-year-old Benzema, 37 is he now, Luka Modric?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's at some point that's got to run out. Maybe Lampard will be the lucky recipient of it. I was quite hoping that Bruno was going to be the recipient of it because, we got the example of Tony Barton at Aston Villa in 1982, who nobody remembers. What did Tony Barton do next? Nobody's got a clue. What did he do before? Again, nobody has a clue. He just came in, won a European Cup and vanished. And Bruno could have been that man. Lampard's not quite such a good story. Or you could have had Potter, who, apart from the games against City, I think the games against City, certainly since the World Cup, are the only games where they haven't had an XG either within sort of quarter of a goal of the opposition, or in most cases better than the opposition. So part I could say, really, apart from the City games, the two of them in quick succession, the FA Cup game and the league game, the XG, and I know talking about XG was one of the things that sort of led to this sort of great outpouring of, oh yeah, what's he talking about? We've just been beaten by Villa. He can't be going on about John McGinn's goal not being a high XG chance. But Potter, I think, has a right to sort of point out, if you believe in the process, if you believe in what his football is, and that presumably was why he was appointed, his football is slightly conservative, I think, by modern standards. But it is a process-driven approach. And the process would suggest that they were actually playing better than results suggested. Where I think they struggled was, I mean, it's obvious, where they struggled was scoring goals. Where they didn't struggle was holding, apart from City, good opponents at arm's length. I could easily have seen a situation in which Potter's Chelsea held Real Madrid off, and they did get the luck, and they did nick the goal. Yeah, that seems to me a far more plausible scenario than Lampard beating Madrid, but it is possible he does so. And then he's got probably, or not probably, potentially a meeting with Tuchel, the man who replaced him at Chelsea in the semi-final.
Yeah, it's perverse. The Elves have been hard at work, namely Arthur outside Jonathan. Northampton Town was Tony Barton's next port of call for a year,
right,
and then a year as caretaker at Portsmouth. Some 6 years later, in 1991. So
okay, well, I apologise to Cobbler's fans for not being up on their managers of the early 80s.
But yeah, the idea of Bruno Salvatore, as he suddenly become this week, being the Tony Barton of the 21st century is quite something. As I mentioned, Chelsea do have irons in the fire, as many as half a dozen, as I mentioned, depending on who you talk to. Again, and possibly they need to be a little bit all over the map in terms of the way they play football, in terms of how they approach the game, in terms of how they deal with the media, etc., etc. But all of those who would be in the queue to be Chelsea manager after Frank Lampard, possibly, would have a right to say, why would I want to be involved in this project whereby you 6 months ago said Graham Potter is the guy, Graham Potter will be given time, Graham Potter will be able to forge his own mould on the team. That turned out not to be the case as soon as results started to not go our way. Why do you think I'm going to get more than 6 months here, and why should I bother applying?
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable question that they ask. I mean, you could, even before Potter, you could point to Tuchel. Tuchel was told, you will have more power than any previous Chelsea manager has ever had. You will be able to choose the players you want to bring in. He brings in, I think, 6 first-team players in the summer, and within a week he's gone. I mean, all those 6 players presumably were immediately go, hang on, we were told Tuchel was going to be given this power. We were told that this was his vision. We were brought in, and presumably Tuchel spoke to them and sold his vision of a club. And then people like Fofana or Sterling, Aubameyang, suddenly, well, hang on, he's gone, and this new bloke's come in, and who is he again? Brighton. Okay, right. What else has he done? Oh, right. Swansea and some the semi-pro team in Sweden. Okay, right. And what's his football? We don't really know. And then as if that uncertainty wasn't enough, suddenly another 8 players signed in January on long-term contracts. All individually, I think, very promising players. They've probably overpaid for a lot of them. But do they fit together? I just don't think there's been any sort of sense of that at all. And that's been my issue with Boehly from the start. That he came in and he started talking about an all-star game, and I know that obviously rubbed people up the wrong way, because it was that classic thing of Americans coming over here telling us how to win our game. But for me, the problem was an all-star game works. Or could potentially work. I mean, I don't pretend to understand the economics of the American model, but it could potentially work in sports where the interaction between players are less important. So in cricket, a sport I do understand, an all-star game makes some kind of sense, because you pick 5 bowlers, you pick 5 batsmen, you pick a wicketkeeper, you will have a reasonably good game. Football, the players have to play alongside each other. They have to know each other's games. There has to be an internal cohesion there. And Boehly seems to have failed to recognise that all the way through. When he announced that Lampard was getting the job, he announced him as a Hall of Famer, which, again, I mean, maybe it is technically true. I don't know. I don't care about the Premier League Hall of Fame. I'm not sure anybody does.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lampard is important to Chelsea because he was part of a side that won 4 league titles. I think he's got 4 league titles, it seems. Is that right? I think. Because he's their record goal scorer, because he's played however many games for them. Yeah, because he was one of the 2 absolute key struts of the most successful period by far in Chelsea's history. It's not that he's been voted into some nonsense website thing that nobody cares about. So that, again, it just the total failure to grasp what the game is about. But Boehly may have tapped into something that fans are happy to see Lampard back, and I guess it is a chance for Lampard to get some sort of redemption for that disappointing reign he had before.
And I'm kind of like, I keep coming back to the Lampard issue. Like, if he isn't successful here, how much longer is he insulated from the realities of the jobs that he has done? Because apart from, like, he had a decent start at Chelsea and then fell away quite rapidly. At Derby, it was a lot of Chelsea loanees that brought them to the edge of promotion. But beyond that, you're kind of thinking, mate, what have you done to actually deserve this string of fortune? I'm still trying to get my head around it. It's still quite bizarre to me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it does happen to big name popular players. I think he might. Yeah, I would warm to him more if he was more. If he acknowledged that fact, the fact that he has been given these opportunities. He always talks about, I've worked very hard. Everybody works very hard. Working hard is the bare minimum. At least acknowledge that he's been given these opportunities. Job he did at Derby, he got them to a playoff final, and what's happened to Derby since suggests that was an achievement. His time at Chelsea, I thought he got that job too early, and I don't think he did it particularly well. Those early results. If you look at the fixture list, the fixture list was kind to him in those early months. He had that long run of 6 or 7 clean sheets in a row, and then you look at them and there's sort of 3-0 and they beat Krasnodar twice, and it's like, okay, it's not that great. I think he was found badly wanting in big games. The fact that they kept conceding goals from set plays, the fact they kept being done on the break, those to me would be massive red flags. I think they're 2 things that the coaches need to get right on the training field. The way he fell out with certain key players, notably Antonio Rudiger, all of that would concern me. His time at Everton is clearly an incredibly difficult job. I wouldn't be too critical of that, but again, he fell out with key people. The same issue, conceding goals on the break, conceding goals from set plays. He has been given opportunities. I'm not really sure he's taken them. The person this might be really good for is Mason Mount. Mason Mount, he absolutely adores, and Mason Mount played really well for him at Derby and in the early days at Chelsea. So if Mason Mount is stalling on his new contract, which appears to be the case, that might actually be the long-term benefit for Chelsea in this, that Mason Mount gets back in the team, starts playing regular again, starts playing well again, and maybe he is persuaded to sign a new contract. And Lampard, to be fair to him, he has brought through other young players. Tomori, although he ended up selling him. Tariq Lamptey gave his first start to. There are a handful. I mean, Hudson-Odoi he brought through, again, has sort of drifted to the periphery. But he did give chances to academy players. So the fact they now have sort of 20 kind of players aged 21 or under in the squad, that's probably good news. It suggests that he's happy dealing with that. But I equally think he could lose every game as Chelsea interim manager, and it shouldn't really affect his standing. I don't know. Maybe if they're absolutely humiliated by Real Madrid, it does. But I mean, this is a bizarre situation he's been put into. I think to judge him, whether it's a success or a failure, to judge him on this next couple of months, I think you've got to look at the context, which is a pretty weird context.
It is very weird context. But where do they go next? Because as I mentioned, the names are kind of all over the map in terms of their approaches, in terms of how they deal with players. Luis Enrique and Julian Nagelsmann are probably the 2 main ones that are in the discussions at the moment. As I say, they really have to pick somebody and stick to it. But given the past 20 years, 25 years of Chelsea, there's nothing to suggest that anybody's going to be hanging around for much longer. So dwelling on their approaches and dwelling on the way that they tackle squads and deal with owners, they're not huge issues because they're probably not going to be there in 24 months' time.
Yeah, and I think in retrospect, what you can see is that Abramovich or Marina Granovskaya, they did have a much sort of clearer vision of Chelsea than perhaps we anticipated, than we perhaps acknowledged at the time. That although coaches kept on being sacked, and although there was sort of, I mean, you can't say that. Yeah, Mourinho was the same sort of coach as Scolari was the same sort of coach as Ancelotti. Yeah, there was some jumping about, but at least in terms of squad building, there seemed to be a general idea there. And although they get criticised for selling De Bruyne and Salah, yes, selling on academy products sorry, I mean neither of them are academy products. Selling on players they bought young or academy products was part of the plan, and it was, I mean, clearly not self-financing, because we now know it costs £900,000 a week, but it's the player production itself at least was self-financing. That, I mean, that's gone out the window with Boehly. So there's not even that plan. I sort of sense that Luis Enrique is probably the favourite. Although that may just be because I'm not really sure where else Luis Enrique goes. His work at Barcelona, I think, was okay, but there was ups and downs in that. And to an extent, he was presiding over a club that was sinking into into this financial abyss that they're still in. His time at Roma, again, was pretty hit and miss. His time at Spain as well, again, some very good moments, some less good moments. But he at least is a man with a clear philosophy. And Chelsea are a club desperately in need of a philosophy, so it seems to work in that sense. I mean, to an extent, I mean, this is clearly a slightly facetious sentence, but he is kind of just a souped-up Potter. That his philosophy is have lots of the ball, don't score many goals.
Yeah,
I mean, they kind of had that. Whereas Nagelsmann, he's much younger. I think he's probably much more in demand than Luis Enrique. I think if Ancelotti does leave Real Madrid this summer, which looks pretty likely, I think there's a fairly good chance Nagelsmann will at least be on their radar. Pochettino, I think, probably quite fancies that job. And if he doesn't get that, I guess he's on the market for whoever wants him. And he probably needs another job, because since he left Tottenham, he had that unconvincing spell as PSG manager, but there's been a lot of downtime. So he probably needs to get back into the game. But at the moment, my sense is that Luis Enrique would be favourite.
Yeah. Jonathan, it's been an absolute pleasure as always. Two things. I want you to come back on when Frank Lampard has won the Champions League and John Terry has done a lap of the pitch in his full kit as well, because he will find a way, even if he isn't part of the coaching team. And we have to do a piece as well on Aston Villa's 82 European Cup winning team and Tony Barton in general, because that's a fascinating story in and of itself.
It really is. I mean, that's the first European Cup final I remember watching, which is maybe why I do remember it, when Tony Barton is for other people has disappeared in the mists of time. But yeah, I remember Jimmy Rimmer getting injured and Nigel Spink coming on and making what to my sort of how old were I been then, five-year-old brain, making a series of brilliant saves and sort of desperately wanting to be Nigel Spink, which I don't think many people have ever said since.
And the thing of a European Cup final being played out in front of a 2/3 full stadium, which we don't get anymore.
Yeah. I mean, look, even Liverpool in '77. There's a great shot from behind. I think it's the far end. No, sorry, it's the end where Liverpool scored the 2 goals in the second half, and that camera shot down. There's huge spaces on those terraces, so. Yeah, again, it didn't used to be a problem getting a ticket for the European Cup final. The
one to look back on, I think, was the Cup Winners' Cup that Mechelen won in the mid-'80s. There's about 15 people at the final. It's like ridiculously poorly attended, but probably understandable given who was involved. Anyway, rabbit hole for YouTube if you want to go down that way. Jonathan Wilson, pleasure as always.
Cheers, thank you.
Cheers.
Football on Off the Ball
with Sky. Watch Premier League, Women's Super League, EFL, Scottish Premiership and much more live on Sky Sports.